Plato's cave and the problem of the future. The problem of the future arises most notably for modern man. Ancient man does not regard the future as a problem. If you study ancient writings, you will see that there is a rather remarkable dearth of mentions of the future. Ancient man is not particularly concerned, worried about the future. We are. Now, one of the most renowned founders of the modern world was Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes teaches us that our primal fear is that of violent death. What does Thomas Hobbes mean by violent death? Violent death is untamed, raw, naked death that violates what? It violates the world of conventions that helps us face death without being overtaken by it, as something rather safe. And since in the past conventions had not succeeded in defending us from death, in taming death, Thomas Hobbes proposes, together with others, including one of his teachers, Machiavelli, to establish a world of conventions, a machinery of conventions, that may progressively come to tame death for us all in the best of all possible ways. We would then eventually no longer be in need of worrying about death. Death would be altogether domesticated, tamed, safe. And of course, today we are quite used to this scenario. We deal with death. How? Well, we have a machinery of conventions. We have psychologists that help us deal with death. We have machines. We have modern medicine. Technology, in general, helps us deal with death. What does dealing with mean here? It means taming. It means reframing. It means securing death and ourselves from it so that we don't need to worry about it any longer. It's all right. You take a pill and you deal with death. And of course, we also deal with the signs of death. And everything that points back to bare, raw death. So we set ourselves up in this artificial, shall we say, world, a world of artifices, in which everything is mediated by, this modern set of fabrications, ultimately technology, that allows us not to worry about what is outside of the modern world. Now, what does this have to do with Plato's cave and the problem of the future? When Thomas Hobbes sets out to tame what he regards as violent death, a death that violates the world Thomas Hobbes wants to live in, or the one in which he believes we should all be living in, he is rejecting an ancient, classical, even natural to us fallen men, vision of the present, of our present condition, involving our falling at all times into the past. This is what death is. We are mortals, say the ancients. Remember your mortality. This is a way we could justifiably translate the Latin memento mori. We are mortals. We are dying. Now, we are shifting into the past. The past is the realm of the dead, the underworld. What is hidden to us and in us, really. We are, as the ancients would say, we are but masks. And the mask, as a mask of the theater, so it's in the ancient world we have wax masks. Right? And we are melting. And as the mask melts, well, the underlying reality is manifested. All right? There's nothing to worry about. With respect to what? The future. We can see why the ancients weren't really worried about the future. We are dying. We are shifting at all times into the past. It's something taken for granted. It's a fatality. Now, certain philosophers, and here we consider Plato, Socrates in Plato, question the fatality of our condition. In Plato's cave, the parable or myth of Plato's cave, men are facing the inner walls of a cave. They're somewhat chained to their condition. They live in a state of compulsion. Do we not all live in a state of compulsion? As we are born, we are fallen, we could say, in a state of compulsion. We're compelled by forces that are unknown to us. All right. So Plato is addressing this evident situation. But he's saying, no, you don't need to be. Something can awaken you. A voice can awaken you out of your condition, invite you to question it. In other words, to turn around from the stream of sensory compulsion. It could call that stream backward. Some voice could turn the stream of sensory compulsions, or the compulsive stream of sensory grasping, appropriation, back upon itself. Now, in traditional terms, we have the distinction between sensory perception and reason, or reflection. And in the modern world, we're used to seeing these two as somewhat complementary, whereby there would be a kind of formal rift between the two. And often we have a hard time thinking of the distinction between the senses and reason. But in the ancient world, we don't have this trouble, in the respect that reason is nothing other than the sensory stream turned back upon itself, reflectively, flexing back upon itself. So what happens then? When the sensory stream is called back upon itself, not to look at itself as autonomous, but to face its origin. There is a reflection at hand. So now the sensory streams sees its own destiny. It was not condemned by some kind of obscure fatality to follow its own projections, if you like, or the shadows of the cave, illusions, the ghosts of the imagination. The sensory stream now faces its origin as its destiny. And as the sensory stream faces its origin, it is illuminated by it. And this light is the light of understanding. So what we have here in classical terms is a conversion of opinions, which we could say amount to vulgar knowledge. When we say that I know something, it's simply that I have a kind of a sensory certainty about it, or that there is such a certainty there, and that I am part of it. So from that to a knowledge grounded in the source of knowledge. So what Plato would say, things themselves, ideas, as the contents of the world in themselves, or rather we could say, as speaking with Plato, as they are in their proper place, which is to say in the mind as opposed to outside of the mind. Though this, of course, raises the problem of, whose mind? And, of course, for Plato this is solved by saying, no mind in itself. Or in Aristotelian terms, this is, of course, thought, thinking itself. In other words, not thought as a predicate, but thought as substance. All right, we are here facing this problem of the future. There is no reference to the future in Plato's parable of the cave. There's no future. We move from a condition in which we are streaming into the past. So there's this streaming that is where everything is passing by, right? Just as the shadows pass by. And we're supposed to remember them or imagine them. To eternity. There is this ascent to eternity from the past. The past understood as the streaming of the present, death, the world of death. We are dying. For Plato, there is no problem about, well, one day I will die. No. The ancients weren't worried about the future. Oh my goodness, we're going to die. Terrible death. Let's do everything we can to prevent this. Let's keep ourselves safe from death. Let's build up a technological world that will tame death for us. It's scary. No. No. This is a modern construct, a modern dream. The ancients were worried about dying well. Living well is dying well. And they cared about the dead. In other words, those who are hidden in the underworld. So they turn toward the past, and they cherish the ancestors. They cherish their inheritance, their fathers. And they're not worried about the future. Things come and go. The future, if anything, belongs to the gods. Of course, in Exodus, in the biblical Exodus, we find Moses being told that, well, God is he who shall be. I shall be the one or that which I shall be. In other words, the future belongs to God. A transcendent future that cannot be reached, that cannot be grasped, because we are moving into the past. How in the world is the present going to build the future, build up the future, something or itself as future, if we are simply shifting into the past? It makes no sense for the ancients. And the medievals, for that matter. It makes sense only to the moderns. Purportedly makes sense. Because we cease to see the present as shifting naturally into the past. Now I say naturally, but Plato questions the fatality of that shift, or opens it up, rather, to something that transcends it. So as we are shifting, yes, there is a shift. But this is a kind of illusion, right? The illusions of the cave. The alternative is this reflexive and reflective assent, recognition. Wherever the word touches, the living word, touches us in the dark, us as characters, as marionettes on the stage. The world is a stage, a theater. This is a classical position that we find all the way into Shakespeare, and we have lost today, although we often might have this intuition and say, well, are we not all actors here on stage? Is this not our play? But then we say, well, if we have been taught, after all, that there's nothing beyond it, and so, other than the absurd. So we live in a matrix, ultimately. This is a theater of the absurd, because there's only the abysmal void outside, the vortex. And so what's the point? We can decorate our theater of the absurd with our gods or our god or whichever god. But ultimately, this is inescapable. Falling short of, being plunged once again into violent death. The final problem that we're to face here is that of Christianity. Christianity tends to be, in the modern world, tends to serve as a vehicle for the propagation of modern ideas. Machiavelli proposed this. He saw this as essential to the establishment of a modern world, what Shakespeare would call Brave New World. Christianity in the modern world, in a modern setting, tends to be a religion of feelings, a progressive religion, again in a modern context, ultimately accepting an evolutionist reading of things, an historical reading of things, and what the 19th century called the historical consciousness. So we have a sense in which we are moving toward an eschatology, of course, we're moving towards the future. But in early Christianity, or in a Christianity that was at its heart ancient, classical, the future belongs strictly to God. What does this mean? It means that we are not at all responsible for bringing that future about. At all. Now, this might sound fatalistic, and so we have early even Protestants who take this radically to mean that, well, there is no input that man can provide to help the situation. God does everything on his own. Kind of divine fatalism. We move into the future of God. We're transferred into it. But now, what does early Christianity have to say about this future that belongs to God? That we do not build, by all means. We prepare for it. He says, well, it's the end of time. Well, when is the end of time? Well, where is the end of space? And early Christian authors, such as St. Augustine, are quite prudent in articulating these questions. In reality, the end of time is not in time. This should be quite clear. The end of space is not in space. It's not a physical, spatial element. You cannot say when the end of time is, because it involves the cessation, the end of chronology. Now, time is, of course, tied to consciousness. And ultimately, there we have the idea that time is within God's mind. It is not a machine that ticks on its own. No such thing. We don't need a relativity theory here. We have the understanding that there is an end to time, but that end corresponds with its beginning. So, again, we have an implied, at the very least implied, cyclical sense of time. The omega can be nothing more than a return to the alpha. So, what does this tell us about the future? The future belongs to God. The future is eternal and will come of its own accord and present itself as the present. The present is the sign of the future. The renewal of the present at every moment. And so, in the present, we see the manifestation of the future, a sign that shifts into the past, that dies out. The sign, the present falls into the past, dies. But at the same time, in itself, it is in its proper place. You see, the present belongs to the future, and the future belongs to God. Now, the present is human consciousness par excellence. Who lives in the present? Who is aware of the present? You say, well, we say, I. There's nothing questionable about the present for other animals. They don't question the present. There's no question of death. Only for man, or rather, man is defined by that question. That question defines man so that wherever that question is, there is a man. Man is the place where the light comes into the dark and bears witness to the source of the light, we could say. So we are witnesses to the source of the present, to the irreducibility of the present to the past. Now, with Plato, this, what we could call the future, which belongs to God, is not presented as really as future. It is a kind of mysterious eternity, or the truth about the past. The truth about the past is not the present as such. It is something more mysterious. It is the truth about the present itself, but the present as such cannot account fully for the past. It is only the future that can redeem fully the past. So with Christianity, the past is not completely and finally redeemed concretely with the first coming of Christ, but only with the second coming. So the first coming shows that there is, in fact, an original redemption. We are saved. We are forgiven and so forth, yeah? But that's a promise. Now the second coming will confirm this. And of course, in Plato's Republic, we see a similar argument. The philosopher announces what is in itself, eternally. All right, so there we have it. The future is not something we should worry about. It is secured. With Plato, this is not altogether evident. With Christianity, it is. Christianity involves the universal announcement of a future that is divine, that belongs to God, that is guaranteed. But in the modern world, we're supposed to move toward that future, approximate it. We're progressives. We progress toward, if only infinitely, toward the future, toward the realization of ancient dreams about eternity. See, there's no outside of the cave in ancient terms. What we have is a building up of the contents of the cave, even of the shadows of the cave, a transforming of them, using them as fuel to build up a kind of new cave that is a progressive one, that is no longer static, but that moves toward the future, even though it cannot fully resolve it within itself. At least it can move in that direction. So we're getting better. We're improving. And we're improving also in the direction of keeping ourselves safe from violent death, which is to say from bare, raw death, from the past. We're no longer simply shifting into the past, into forgetfulness. We are preserving ourselves through what we call technology. We're preserving our heritage, our memories, our past. And so our present refrains from shifting, fading, disappearing into the past by entrusting itself to the technological logic and instrument. And so even if we cannot achieve God, we can at least try to approximate it. This is how we live today, and as a result of our way of living, we tend to disregard, even ignore altogether, the bare problem of reflection as understood in the ancient world. So we seek solutions more than understanding, or understanding in terms of the process of solution making, solution producing. The primacy, the absolute primacy of contemplation over praxis, over doing things, is lost. So we seek agreement or disagreement in productive, progressive manners, rather than ultimately understanding. Even faith is supposed to be a means to the establishment of a better society, or the approximation of a divine future. The classical notion of fides quaerens intellectum, which is to say, trust, asking for understanding, and that was it. This understanding that is the heart of the life of reflection, which is to say, the stream of sensory compulsion, turning back to its source, right? To be illuminated by it, and this illumination is precisely this understanding. That is all lost. Now, reason is a kind of machine that saves the sensory stream from an otherwise violent death.